This teach-in is on ideology and the idea that Occupy is some form of critique of ideology. And I've basically divided it into three parts. The first part I'll talk about what is ideology, how do we identify it. And the second part I want to talk about what is it about Occupy that makes it somehow critical of dominant ideologies. And the third part is when I wanted to talk about, or I will talk about, kind of a case study of ideology, or two case studies. One is the foreclosure crisis and our response to it, our being the state response to it. And the second one is a local issue here in Denver. There's a proposed ordinance banning urban camping, the euphemism for anyone who wants to sleep or must sleep outside, and they want to use some kind of covering to protect them from the elements. That's considered camping, and that will be illegal. So the idea here is we talk about ideology, and then we look at these specific issues and look at the ideological components within them, right? Okay, but I wanted to start with the ideology part with a transcript from an exchange that happened between Henry Waxman, a representative from California, and Alan Greenspan. And this happened in October of 2008. I'm just going to read that here. So Waxman writes, Dr. Greenspan, I'm going to interrupt you just, the question I have for you is, you had an ideology. You had a belief that free, competitive, and this is your statement, quote, I do have an ideology. My judgment is that free, competitive markets are by far the unrivaled way to organize economies. We've tried regulation. None meaningfully worked, end quote. Waxman continuing, that was your quote. You had the authority to prevent irresponsible lending practices that led to the subprime mortgage crisis. You were advised to do so by many others, and now our whole economy is paying its price. Do you feel that your ideology pushed you to make decisions that you wish you had not made? Greenspan, the Oracle of Wall Street. Well, remember that what an ideology is a conceptual framework with the way people deal with reality. Everyone has one. You have to. To exist, you need an ideology. The question is whether it is accurate or not. And what I'm saying to you is yes, I've found a flaw. I don't know how significant or permanent it is, but I've been very distressed by that fact. Waxman, you found a flaw in the reality? Greenspan, flaw in the model that I perceived as the critical functioning structure that defines how the world works, so to speak. By the way, he's a Rand student. Ayn Rand was Greenspan's teacher and advisor. Waxman, in other words, you found that your world, or your view of the world, your ideology was not right. It was not working. Greenspan, precisely. That's precisely the reason I was shocked, because I had been going for 40 years or more with very considerable evidence that it was working exceptionally well. Now, this is an amazing confession by Greenspan. You don't get this very often, right? But there was no clear consequence to this confession. No major policy shift, no different practices, right? But it was something that was quite remarkable. And I wanted to start with Greenspan because, first of all, it's rare that you get anyone that defines ideology. So I'm impressed that in a congressional hearing he defines ideology. But how he defines it is important. So he defines ideology as a kind of neutral interpretive framework, right? The way we think about a theory in science. So we create this theory, we test it against the world, it bumps up against the world resists it somehow, and then we revise the theory. Very neutral. But what's missing is how ideology reflects relations of power and domination, and how an ideology justifies the conditions that will reproduce that form of inequality or domination. This is why it's really important for us to look at the notion of ideology and then actually subject our practices and thoughts to critique, to see to what extent they are ideological and are influenced by these forms of domination and forms of inequality, right? Power relations. And that's incredibly important for any kind of social movement like Occupy in order to have effective practices, right? So let me say a few things about what ideology isn't then. So generally speaking, ideology is not a collection of false claims, the result of intentional deception, the reflection of a partisan view, so an ideologue, right, for a particular party, or merely an attempt to neutrally kind of represent the world. This is not ideology. It can be propaganda, it can be advertising, it can be lies, but this is not how I'm defining ideology. So ideology is something different. So what is ideology? Terry Eagleton, a very prominent social theorist, actually wrote an entire book on ideology, and he started it with the quote, "Nobody has yet come up with a single adequate definition of ideology, and this book will be no exception." Indeed, says Eagleton, even if one could do it, it would be unhelpful. So with that being said, let me give you my definition of ideology, and let's see how it goes. You have to tell me what you think about it. So how I'm defining ideology is, generally speaking, it is a set of commitments and concepts that reflect dominant material interests and is used to interpret our experience of the world in a way that reproduces social conditions which support those dominant interests. If we were to think of ideology as located in an argument, it would be the first unquestioned premise. That is to say, our thought process begins with ideology and therefore ends with representations and discourse that are inflected by ideology. Okay, so then the question is, what are dominant material interests, and what are these conditions that they try to reproduce? So material interests arise from and support particular material conditions, policies, and social relations. In The Wealth of Nations, Adam Smith famously wrote, "It is not the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer, or the baker that we expect our dinner, but from their regard to their own interests," by which he meant self-interest and not moral consideration for the other. So somehow the outcome that benefits us is a result of self-interested action, right? Self-interest in the material benefit that your actions bring. Okay, so there's all different kinds, so different interests, ideological or material interests, can take different forms. They can relate to capitalism, they can relate to politics, they can relate to race, gender, sexuality, physical ability, etc. And in the case of capitalism, which is what I'm going to mostly focus on, dominant material interests include, for example, deregulation, market-oriented values, great wealth inequality, and the mobilization of state power in order to defend it. Because our society is divided into classes, the material interests that are dominant, which reflect those values that I just listed, or those practices and policies, are not those of the homeless, the elderly, the sick, and almost all working people, right? So when I say dominant material interests, I don't mean the material interests for everybody. I mean the material interests that dominate in that system, that are most predominant in that system because they benefit some group. Okay, so what are social and material conditions? In terms of economy, we're talking about the present mode of production, which is the capitalist mode of production, distribution and consumption of goods, as well as social relations of hierarchy and the laws and policies that support them. So the idea here is that if there's a material interest, it's an interest that's somehow located in production, distribution, circulation, And then when we talk about other forms, and also social relations of hierarchy, but those social relations of hierarchy we also see in other forms of ideology, like patriarchy, white supremacy, etc. Right? So although I'm mostly going to talk about capitalism and economic forms of ideology and talk a bit about political ideologies, the notion of ideology, its relation to material interests and conditions can be applied to other forms, right? So patriarchy, white supremacy, etc. Okay, but it's very difficult to identify ideologies, in part because they're so close to us, right? If they are, in a sense, that first unquestioned premise in our thought process, then those are going to be the most difficult things to, in a sense, unearth, reveal, and critique. All right, and I'm sorry, I have to quote Rumsfeld and invoke Zizek. Some of you probably know this, but the philosopher Slavoj Žižek once quoted, or often quotes, Donald Rumsfeld as an example, or something that Rumsfeld said as an example of where we can locate ideology. Now, Rumsfeld made this famous quote, or made this famous claim in the build-up to the Iraq War, and he was discussing what are the capabilities and threats and risks that the Saddam Hussein regime represents, right? And so he said, there are known knowns. So we know that, for example, we know how many planes they have, which they didn't have any, by the way. We know, artillery. We know these things. They're known knowns. The second one was known unknowns. For example, it was claimed we don't know if they have particular kinds of chemical weapons, right? And we know that we don't know it. So it's a known unknown. And then there's an unknown unknown. Okay, I'm getting nervous. Okay, and so Zizek says, quite famously, but there's another category, right? And this is known unknowns. Or, sorry, let me reverse that, unknown knowns, right? So somehow there's something that we know, but we don't know that we know it. So we're committed to something, a belief, a principle, or concept, but we don't realize that we're committed to it. So it's an unknown known. And Zizek says this is, in a sense, the realm of ideology. And I think it's a useful way of describing it. Okay, but even once we identify ideology, so, you know, and we're going to have a whole list of things tonight that we can say that's ideological, that's a concept or commitment that somehow represents dominant material interests, and those interests are not ones that I share, and so maybe I will join a social movement and resist them. The move that we need to make after identifying ideological commitments is to identify those material interests and then act to actually transform those interests or those material and social conditions. Because if we don't, then those ideological commitments will live on. They are, in a sense, reflections of those material interests. This is why, for example, Greenspan's confession didn't lead to the US government or the Federal Reserve to radically change its policies, although he said the justification for everything that he did was based on a model that was false. So how could it be that once we identify something that's so out of sync with empirical reality that it would live on? And that's why we'll talk about zombies. So, Princeton professor, New York Times columnist, Paul Krugman, right? So he picks up on an Australian economist's idea called zombie economics, and he uses this, and I think it's really a nice way of capturing what we're talking about. So Krugman writes, when historians look back, and he wrote this in 2008, oh no, 2010. When historians look back at 2008 through 2010, what will puzzle them most, wow. I don't know if we're going to have to take shelter or something. I think we're okay. Okay, but if you see a funnel cloud, let me know. So let me start over. Okay, so Krugman writes, when historians look back at 2008 through 2010, what will puzzle them most, I believe, is the strange triumph of failed ideas. Free market fundamentalists have been wrong about everything, yet they now dominate the political scene more thoroughly than ever. And he adds, the free market fundamentalists have been wrong about events abroad as they have about events in America, and suffered equally few consequences. Now Krugman is right on. You can go through and list by the dozens all of the failed predictions, all of the failed policies, and you can call them out, you can forefront them, you can subject them to critique, and they just won't go away. They won't go away. And in fact, what we see is a doubling down, right? You see the rhetoric and the kind of commitment to these ideas become even more passionate, even more vocal. And this is what we saw in the Tea Party. The Tea Party was, in a sense, a revival of these ideas, a defense of these ideas, because they came under attack and scrutiny because they, in this crisis, were exposed as being somehow completely out of touch, right? So the Tea Party can play that role, right? They were doubling down on the same economic ideology that Alan Greenspan himself. I love Alan Greenspan. It's a good example because what we see is we see this incredible defense mechanism kick into gear when there's vulnerability. And so you see that in terms of justification for the US wars. So as soon as the wars seem to not be accomplishing what they were said, they were supposed to accomplish, or the reasons that were given to justify the war, originally some kind of threat, etc., once that vanishes, then you have, in a sense, a total exposure of the institution, or in this case, the state, to critique. And so the reaction is to do an offensive. You go out and you speak in the most extreme terms, both about your values, right, about heroes and what freedom and those kinds of things, but also toward critics. So once you get a resistance, that resistance, even if it's not trying to do something radical, will be denounced as fascists and communists, etc. Right? You see this rhetoric go up because the vulnerability has gone up. There's, in a sense, a legitimation crisis that opens up the state or financial institutions to serious critique, right? And transformation if there's a social movement that's involved in it. So I think that's absolutely right, yeah. And so getting back to the zombies, the idea here is that because ideology is related to material interests, powerful material interests, no amount of just criticizing them will do away with them. Even the confession, as we saw on the part of Greenspan, will not do away with them. They support the dominant material interests that are invested in the status quo. And as I'll talk about in a minute, that status quo is defended by coercive power, right? So the dominant material interests are protected by the police, by the army, right? By the FBI, CIA, etc. So these are, in a sense, the coercive tools that dominant interests can mobilize to defend themselves when the legitimation crisis hits, right? So you'll see, this is why you see this at the same time that you have economic and political crises in the United States, you get an incredible militarization of the police, of the borders, more wars, more foreign activity, right? This is a reaction to that vulnerability. And this is a mobilization of the state and its coercive force to defend dominant interests, right? Okay, so ideology runs deep. It can take on a zombie-like character once it's exposed. And it relates to or influences how we think about social, economic, political institutions, how we think about social relations and the values of those kinds of relations, and even how we think about ourselves. And that one, and what I'm talking about in that sense is myself as an individual that's raced, classed, gendered, right, has a particular position in society, relationship to property, et cetera, that ideology justifies and legitimates those forms of identity. And so if you're doing ideology critique, if you're exposing certain ideologies, they are going to affect the most intimate kind of self-conception or self-understanding that you have, your very identity. And so when those are very difficult to reveal, expose, critique, and those are the ones that also get tremendous pushback when you criticize them, right? So when you, for example, when you challenge white supremacy, you challenge kind of the universalization of whiteness in our culture and how kind of white and maleness as universal norms, if you push back against those kind of ideological principles or commitments, that's affecting people who identify as white. And so they get pissed, right? The first reaction is often a very intimate emotional reaction because that's literally how they identify themselves. So ideology is not something out there in the air, ideas that we play around with. They actually have material force, and they are ways of, for us to see who we are or think about who we are and our own identities. Okay, so I talked about coercion, so I want to talk a little bit about crisis. It's moments of crisis, and we've experienced two major crises. An economic crisis that started with the subprime mortgage crisis and then, in a sense, spread through the financial industry, and then that affected industry, et cetera. And then the crisis of the state to respond to that. So we have those crises, and crises are the opportunity to, in a sense, forefront, critique, articulate, and take down certain ideological principles, right? That's the opportunity. But again, that can't be done just by voice. It has to be done by action as well. That's where you get social movements, and that's why you get Occupy, right? Occupy is a response to dominant ideologies that have been exposed and weakened in a crisis or crises. Okay, so let me just go through, I made a little list here, it's not comprehensive at all, of some of the dominant kind of ideological commitments that we experience almost on a daily basis, if not a daily basis. So the first one is this idea of selfish individualism. It's so powerful. It's radical individualism, right? The individual is somehow antecedent to the state, antecedent to all social relations, has rights and powers before any kind of social relations. All social relations are mediated by right, which is, in a sense, mediated by contractual relations. We even have come to think about the formation of states as being based on a contract, that a bunch of individuals came together, consented to enter into a contract, and formed a state. This is an ideological commitment, this idea that we relate in ways that are mediated by right. Rewards and punishment on this model, success and failure, the pursuit of material gain, selfishness are all a part of this. Work and creativity can only be motivated by the incentive of profit. These are ideas that are associated with this kind of radical individualism. Another ideological commitment to representation, the idea that politics is somehow just voting and representation. And representation here is the act of individuals transferring their power to speak and act for themselves to another, to a representative, right, who is now empowered to speak and act for you. This is not a definition of democracy. This is a definition of representation. Those are different things, right? And as it happens, our representatives are overwhelmingly millionaires and white males. I just wanted to throw that out there. Okay. Meritocracy, that our political and economic systems are based on merit. So those who succeed did so because of their merit. Those who sink or fall through the cracks or don't succeed, it's because they lacked something, right? Maybe they had bad moral character, or they were just lazy, right? Because our systems are meritocratic. Freedom. Freedom is not political freedom. It's not self-determination. It's not connected with democratic participation. It's connected with right and private property, right? So freedom is our dominant concept of freedom. When people usually talk about freedom, when the Tea Party defends freedom, they're defending private property right. The idea that the individual has the right to use, transfer, and exclude others from their property. So that's the dominant idea of freedom. Trickle-down economics, we all know that somehow if we give a lot of money to the wealthy or give them all the benefits, then we just wait for it to come down, and it'll come down. Privatization, that things are best used efficiently and to the best ends when they're in private hands. Value, capitalists produce value. Workers are lucky to get a job. Class, classes don't exist, and there is no such thing as class interest, but there is class mobility. Competition, since we're naturally selfish, competition and profit is what drives us. Cooperation and collaboration are for motives that are unnatural somehow. So we don't naturally somehow we aren't naturally somehow motivated to collaborate, cooperate, work together on projects. We'll only work if there's an incentive of profit. That's the dominant, and I'm generalizing, of course. I mean, these have millions of permutations, but in general. Law is by its very nature unbiased. The state acts in the interests of the common good. Wars are fought in national defense. The police serve and protect the public, arresting only those who break the law. Occupy Denver, of course, would find that one. Yeah, anyways. Unions are bad. Chambers of commerce, good. We can also add white people are trustworthy, men are rational, and heterosexuals are moral. And of course, corporations are people, and money is constitutionally protected speech. So these are the kinds of things that influence so many of the kind of theories and practices that we have in our society. Okay, so that's ideology. Then I just wanted to say a few things about why Occupy is, in practice, a critique of this ideology. So obviously we're talking about people coming together and working together, collaborating, working in collective projects to achieve something that is not about profit, right? The ethos of Occupy is definitely not one that's based on rights. It's based on obligations, shared sacrifices, right? We don't look at the individuals that we're dealing with in Occupy as somehow competitors or selfish, or that we have to like mediate our interactions with them through right or contract. We feel an obligation to others and work together with others to solve collective problems. This is part of what it is to be democratic, right? We are all, in a sense, collectively participating in our own collective self-determination. Okay, I have a lot of stuff here that I can't talk about much, so I'm just going to hit a few points because then I want to talk about the foreclosures, urban camping ban issue. But I do want to talk about this idea of democracy in Occupy. And I find the work of Hannah Arendt very useful in this way. Some academics say, no, don't use Hannah Arendt. There's all kinds of implications about the private sphere, et cetera, et cetera. I don't think what I'm pulling from that has those implications. I think what she says about the rise of a council form or kind of horizontal form of democratic practice during these moments of crisis or rupture is really insightful. And what she says is that when people congregate and speak and act together toward a common purpose, they create a polis. They create a democratic collective. And in that collectivity, through that speaking and acting together, you create power. It's not the kind of power that can be transferred. It doesn't last after we disperse. It's not force and it's not strength. It's a different kind of power. It's an associative form of power. It's a democratic form of power. And I know a lot of people in Occupy have felt that kind of power when we speak and act together. And the idea here with Arendt and why I think it's so important to look at her is the importance of space. I talked about representation, how voting and representation are considered, in a sense, the B-end or the totality of political activity. That is what politics is, right? But that excludes this coming together in a shared space to practice democracy. So Arendt's idea is that a polis can emerge anywhere. It can emerge in a park. It can emerge in the Denver Public Library. It can emerge wherever we come together and speak and act together. And there's something interesting that happens when we do that is, one, we discover and learn things about who we are that we could never do without participating in those things. So what you see is when people come into the Occupy movement and start participating, they realize things about themselves that they never knew. They become a different kind of person. And in a sense, those practices cultivate a democratic subjectivity. You are becoming a democratic subject through those acts and forms of participation, right? And this can be difficult as well. Obviously, as I've mentioned before, you have to, in a sense, cultivate skills of listening, working together, patience. These are skills that we all have to have if we're going to be participating in a democracy. And I think the other thing that emerges out of this as a critique of dominant ideology is this move away from right, which also includes private property right. The idea is that, and this is why Occupy is very critical of a lot of the practices of capitalism, if not of capitalism itself, is that this is associated with private property right, which in its execution or in its practices are anti-democratic, right? So the idea is that we see the power in our economy and in the kind of collective power of the wealthiest in our society, right? The 1%. They have tremendous amounts of power. They control most of the resources in the country, and those are not subject to democratic practices, democratic control, democratic input, democratic debate. Those are in the private sphere. Those are private power. And so we bump up against that private power as we practice democracy in the public, right? We see that all the time. Okay, so let me just say really quickly, I just want to mention a few things to think about when we're actually carrying out an ideology critique. I mentioned the foreclosure issue and I mentioned the proposed urban camping ban. But these are just questions. I'm just going to read these questions that I think we need to think about when we're faced with struggles over something like the foreclosure crisis. So the first question is, what are the material interests of the people or institutions involved? How are social, political, and economic systems conceived, legitimated, or concealed? How is the rhetoric of responsibility being used and who is implicated? What values and concepts are employed to describe individuals, their actions, and their relations? So if we look, for example, just very quickly at the foreclosure crisis and the bailout, right, the material interests in the foreclosure crisis, the dominant material interests, are to get legal immunity from any criminal activity that caused that, and to get recapitalization from all the money that was lost in betting against homeowners in the financial market. And that's what we saw happen. We saw bailouts of the banks, bailouts of mortgage companies, but not bailouts of the people. So we see where the resources went to support those material interests. Responsibility. Those who lost their homes in a recession that they didn't cause. Those who lost their homes because of fraudulent criminal activity on the parts of banks and service agencies, mortgage agencies. It wasn't their responsibility, but they lost their home, right? And then the interesting thing to keep in mind when you look at these kinds of crises is to see when the rhetoric of morality comes up. Because usually when things are going really well for dominant material interests, morality is not on the table. You start bringing in moral issues and they'll start quoting Adam Smith and saying, it's not the benevolence of the baker, the brewer, whatever, it's selfish interest. But when something like the foreclosure crisis happens and people say, bail us out, it's not our fault, people say, well, that's moral hazard, we're going to somehow violate the very principles of an economy, so we can't, because then people would do all kinds of stuff and we'd bail them out, like the banks. So, and it's the same thing with this proposed urban camping ban, right? What are the material interests involved? Whose interests are being served by an ordinance that makes it illegal for people to cover themselves when they're forced to sleep outside because they don't have a home? Is it an ordinance that serves the interests of the homeless? Or is it an ordinance that serves the interests of some other group?
Is it a response to the Occupy movement, or is it a response to the homeless individuals that are unrelated to the Occupy movement?
I'm not sure how you'd be able to separate those two. Because what you have, what we see in Denver, at least, and I know it's in other places as well, is homelessness has become an issue for Occupy. And homelessness has become politicized in the city. So homelessness is increasing. And the actual beds and services for homeless are decreasing. So they were just cut. The number of beds and services, the budgets were just cut, right? So homelessness is increasing, services are decreasing, but then the downtown Denver partnership, business partnership, feels their interests threatened by growing homelessness that's concentrated around the Capitol and 16th Street Mall, right? And you'll see, for example, we can look at the coverage in the Denver Post, for example, the one newspaper we have here, or one major newspaper we have here, and they've come out supporting the ban with the most ridiculous arguments, never disclosing that they're a member of the Downtown Business Partnership. They are the ones who basically wrote and are pushing the ordinance, but they're not saying that. So they're, in a sense, the organ of this argument. They're representing this to the public as somehow the neutral press, but they are, in fact, those dominant material interests that are invested in this ordinance, right? And so these are the kinds of things that we need to keep in mind when we're thinking about policies and we're thinking about practices, right? So I'm going to end there, and we can open up for discussion, and thank you for your time.